A couple of years ago, I gave a commencement address at Skidmore College, and the other speaker was Cornel West. And people were asking me the week before, like, aren't you nervous? You got to get up there with Cornel West. And I was like, look, I'm fine because I'm the opening act. Once Cornel West is done, no one will even remember I was there. Well, I might be a professor, but I did not do the homework. So I got there only to learn from the program that I was immediately following Cornel West. And needless to say, I was a little nervous as I sat there. It seems I've learned nothing because I'm so honored to be here and thankful to Brian, to Rachel, to Andrew, and everyone who's helped put this on. But I would like to talk to the manager because I was not told I would be appearing after Rachel and Representative Raskin. So I'm going to be putting that in my evaluation. All right. I want to talk a little bit about what I think Christian nationalism is. I want to talk about how it threatens our democracy, and hopefully it will provide some fruitful things for us to continue with throughout the weekend. And I know it's a topic we're going to revisit. So let's start with this. What is Christian nationalism? Is this good? Yep, there we go. Yeah. All right, here we go. So many of you are probably familiar with Perry and Whitehead, and they tell us that Christian nationalism exists on a spectrum. There are folks who are hardcore Christian nationalists. There are folks who are maybe less so, but nonetheless still affirm that our laws should be governed by the Bible, that our politicians should be Christian believers of some certain kind, and so on and so forth. Now, what really interested me, and sorry, my slides are moving really quick here. If I can just go back. Yep. Let's see. All right. You got it? Okay. Thanks so much. Okay. So I think there's three foundational components to Christian nationalism. One is a nostalgia for the past. One is an idea that this is a Christian nation, and it was built as a Christian nation for and by Christian people. The other is an idea that we are in a crisis, and that if something isn't done by Christian people, then the country will go by the wayside, okay? Now, if we can go to the next slide. We can get in, sorry, this, yeah. We can get into this a little bit. So, first of all, we have a situation where Christian nationalists think that this country was built for and by white Christians. Now, this goes exactly opposite of everything Rachel just talked about, that there is a sense of privilege, and there's a desire to maintain that privilege. My co-host and colleague, Dan Miller, always says that it's easy to think that when rights and representation are extended to all people, everyone wins. The Christian nationalist does not agree with that by any means. Andrew Seidel says all the time that we're not coming for your rights, Christian nationalists, we're coming for your privilege. And guess what? That's exactly what they're afraid of. The idea is that this is a country built for and by them. It doesn't mean that the rest of us can't be here. It just means we need to know our place. Now, the second is a nostalgia for past glory. Christian nationalists love the city on a hill metaphor. 1630, John Winthrop, Massachusetts Bay. This will be a city on a hill. Ronald Reagan loved this. John Kennedy loved this idea. Newt Gingrich loved this idea. But the idea is that this was a Christian nation that was once great. It was once a city on a hill, but no more. You know, the city on a hill got kind of invaded a little bit. Some interlopers got in, some of the people in this room. We might need to put up a wall around that city on a hill now, you know, just to kind of, that's what Jesus would want, right? Just to kind of keep some of those folks out. There's a sense that this country has gone downhill. So the goal, if we can go to the next slide, is to go backwards, not forwards. The idea of progress is anathema to the Christian nationalist. The goal is not equal rights and representation for all people. The goal is not to live up to what Rachel just talked about in the pursuit of life, liberty, and equality for everyone. It is not all beliefs. It is not equality without exception. It is a sense of going back to a time when Christian nationalists, and more specifically, white Christian landowning men, were privileged in the country. So if you ask Christian nationalists, Hey, when was the country great? Let's talk about it. Y'all ever had this talk at your barbecue? Huh? You've been on Facebook talking to your uncle about this? All right, uncle, tell me, when was it great? And you know what the Christian Nationalists often tell you? About 70% will tell you? 1950s. So here's the thing about the 1950s, and I know I don't need to tell you this, but I'm going to say it anyway, okay? 1950s is a time before the Civil Rights Movement, before the end of Jim Crow. It's a time before the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, before the sweeping immigration reform that changed the country in the mid-1960s. It's a time before the feminine mystique was published in 1963. It's a time before the Levin case made interracial marriage something protected throughout the whole land. A kid like me with a Japanese American dad from Maui and a white mom from Tennessee, 1967 Loving says, hey, you're not a crime, you're okay. 1969 Stonewall and the myriad of queer liberation movements that happened well before and certainly after that. The 1950s is a time before the white Christian nationalists sees the country as becoming out of order. It's a time when to them there were two genders. When white Christian people were the ones on television, the ones holding office locally, on the state level, and certainly on the federal level. It's a time when all of the pesky folks who wanted what was promised to them had not yet been able to achieve so much of what happened in the 1960s and beyond. So the goal is to go backwards. This extends from the family to the household to the society. We talk a lot about family values. We're going to talk all this weekend about court cases that are being brought. What's the link? The link is this. If you can have a nuclear family based on white cultural norms with a patriarchal father, a submissive wife, heterosexual only, two children who see their father as the voice of God in their household, who submit to his rules and his punishment. If you can have that, that's the building block of society. And then you're going to extend that to your household, which is exactly what pro-slavery theologians did in the 19th century. And say anyone in my household should be under the same patriarchal structure. And then we're going to say, you know, if that works for the family, I think that should work for society too. And we're going to extend that everywhere we can go. And the privilege of our vision for society, the way that we see how society should be ordered, is what we're going to take to our state houses, to our mayoral races, to the fights at our school board meetings, and to the Supreme Court. So we have a vision that goes from right here in the family, the divine family, a sacred familialism, as Sophie Bork-James calls it, to a myopic, narrow, and exclusionary vision of society. Now, the next part is the idea that the end of America is near. Y'all might have heard this. I don't know if you've heard that. But before the 2020 election, it was said often and always, in Joe Biden's America, you won't be safe. If Kamala Harris is vice president, the country will go to ruin. These are radicals. Now, just no laughter. But Joe Biden is a radical. I'm on video, so we're just going to leave that, okay? Joe Biden is a radical, and if he's elected president, you're going to live in a communist, socialist state, right? But let's dig deeper, because it is funny, and you know, there's reasons it's funny, and I'm going to leave those alone, okay? I've learned my lessons. But what does that do? Let's ask what that does, right? As a religion professor, I'm so much less interested in what people believe, and I want to know what their religion does for them, right? What does it do? What does religion do? Well, what does the apocalypse of America do for the Christian nationalists? Fear is right. So if you're afraid and you're in an emergency, guess what? You need to act like you're in an emergency. I have a little baby at home. She's 19 months old. I got a lot of pictures on my phone. Come up to me afterward. I'll show them to you. You know, when her and I leave the house, it takes like, I don't know, 47 minutes to get out of that, right? We got to get diapers, change of clothes. We got another change of clothes. We got to get milk. We got to get all kinds of stuff. We got to get the bag, somehow remember the car keys. I have to remember that I need to wear pants and a shirt. That's usually important. And it's like, you know, 47 minutes before we get out. But you know what? In an emergency, I live in California. If there's an earthquake, I'm not going to do any of that business. I'm just going to grab that little baby and get out of the house. You know why? Because in an emergency, you don't follow protocol, norms, or processes. You don't think about the future. You don't think about what's next. Your goal is to get safe, any means possible. The short term is the only term. The white Christian nationalist apocalyptic narrative justifies eschewing all the norms, processes, all of the ways that we do business in democratic institutions. And it says right now, today, you better save America. And you need to do that any way possible. So for me, this naturally leads to, and you can go to the next slide here, it leads to politicians warning us about Joe Biden's America, but it also leads, and we can go to the next slide here already, it leads to what I call the authoritarian turn in white Christian nationalist politics. Because look, if you're in an apocalypse and the world is going to end, democracy takes a long time. Democracy is kind of inconvenient. Democracy's kind of slow, and guess what? You may not have the votes, and you may know that. You may know as a Christian nationalist, you're actually the minority. You may know that the people in this room represent the majority of Americans, that this is, in this room, a representation of Americans united. So democracy is kind of, I don't know, annoying. And you know what's helpful? Authoritarianism. Because authoritarianism allows you to act without hearing the voices of others. It allows you to impose your vision without concern for anyone else's. It allows you to exclude on the basis that you are protecting the nation and your people rather than hurting many of the people within it. Authoritarianism is convenient for the Christian nationalists because it is the only way they can actually get what they want. Next slide. You're saying, well, you're a professor, prove it. Well, here it is. So here's Alan Carlson saying that there are great experiments all over the world, whether they be in Poland, whether they be in Orban's Hungary, whether they be in Putin's Russia. The praise for authoritarians such as Putin goes back a long time. In my book, I talk about how this started in the 90s, and Paul Weyrich, the architect of the Council for National Policy, many of whom you are familiar with, was taking trips to Russia at the turn of the millennium. He realized then, always the visionary, unfortunately, he realized then they didn't have the votes. And he realized then that authoritarian leaders who don't wait for Congress, who don't stack the judicial deck, authoritarian leaders who act without asking are the way forward for the Christian right. If we go to the next one, we see a video, and I hope our video is going to play. We'll see if it works. This is Republican candidate for Senate in 2020 for the state of Delaware, Lauren Witzka. She received 57% of the vote in the primary, and she has some really interesting things to say about Putin and Orban. All right. Coming? Okay. So keep in mind, this is a candidate for Senate, United States Senate, not Delaware State. This is somebody who received 57% of the vote.
Christian nationalist nation. They're actually Orthodox Christian and Russian Orthodox. So, I actually support Putin's right to protect his people and always put his people first, but also protect their Christian values. I identify more with with Putin's Christian values than I do with Joe Biden. So, there is that. There is that there. And, Christian nationalist countries also are a threat to the global regime, like the Luciferian regime. It wants to mash everything together, but Putin takes care of his people. He looks out for his people. I watched as he deported, they literally walked them through the streets, the criminal illegals who were coming into their country. They walked them out and they escorted them out and they said, get out. I can respect that. I can respect that. And I can respect the fact that Putin does everything he can to protect his people.
All right. Enough said. No commentary needed. Authoritarians like Putin have become the model leader for a segment of the American population, as you just saw, who have lost their majority but want to maintain power. They want a pure American body, a body that would be purified of any sense of queerness, any sense of non-whiteness, any sense of those who are non-Christian, who don't believe like them. Democracy is not the ideal form for Lauren Witzka, for many of her cohorts, because democracy does not provide the pathway to what they want. The worldview is about power. The sacred value is not the voice of the people. The sacred value is enacting the voice and will of God in the way that they understand it. We can go to the next slide, and we see this. We see that someone like Putin represents for the Christian nationalists the ideal Christian leader. If you all follow along with the rhetoric Putin uses these days, what does he talk about? He talks about a holy war against Ukraine. He talks about protecting Russia from those who would threaten its what? Christian values, nuclear families, spiritual heritage. He learned early on from the likes of Alan Carlson and James Dobson and Paul Weyrich how to use that language. And now he's using it in his own country. And now American Christian nationalists are looking to people like him as the models for what they want to see in this country. We can go to the next slide. And we're going to have to skip ahead. So I'm going to skip ahead. This slide says, and it's just very stunning. I'm happy to talk more about this later. I actually don't want to, but I'm happy to talk about it. A group of folks who are like Lauren Witzka, who say openly, I'm a fascist. I converted to this version of Christianity because I am a fascist. And that's what I want to be. We can go to the next slide. And we can even skip one ahead here. We don't need to hear from Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin, way back in 2000, in Obama's time, praised Putin herself and said he rides around on a horse with no shirt on, and that's what we want. And Obama does nothing but wear mom jeans, which I have some mom jeans, and they're very comfortable, and I enjoy them, okay? Yeah. Now, there's one more I want to mention. This book just came out a couple months ago. It's The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. He openly talks in this book about the fact that when Jesus says to love your neighbor, here's what he means. Love those who are like you. Love those who share your ethnicity. That's what God wants. That's what he says in the book. He openly talks about Volk and homeland as the basis for Christian ethics and the way to build a Christian society. And I know what you're thinking. This is a fringe book. You pulled this out of it's a manifesto, right? Written in a basement somewhere. When this book debuted, it was in the top 100 on Amazon. So you got about 3 million books on Amazon, top 100. It remained in the top 5,000 for months, and it continues to be a bestseller. This is what we're up against. If we go ahead, we can see that January 6th and what happened there should not surprise us. That in many ways, the people who believe that this country was built by and for them were there to reclaim the nation they think is rightfully theirs. To them, it was the act of patriots who were obeying God, not traitors, not criminals, not trespassers. Now, I just want to finish because I'm almost out of time here, and I want to just finish by talking about the stories that we tell, because I'm going to tell you something. I used to be a Christian nationalist. I converted when I was 14, like some of you in the room. This was the movement that I was part of as an adolescent and a young adult. I became a minister at 20. And I left that movement in my early 20s, but you know what has stuck with me ever since is that this movement tells a story. It gives everybody who participates in it a role to play. It says you're a Christian and a real American. Now, what I was also told is that those who were not part of us were not real Americans. I was told that they hated our country's values. Now, 15 years ago, I left that movement, and I've discovered a lot of things. The certainty I was promised as an evangelical has given way to a wondrous complexity. There's an understanding of my condition as a human being and my living with and by, for, and with and to others, all of you in this room, as one that's filled with nuance and beauty, the joy of discovering those with a different worldview, who come from a different place, who have a different culture. It's messy, but it's also incredible. The death of my evangelical God opened up a horizon of intellectual discovery and community like I never experienced before. But it also opened something else that I think we can't miss this weekend. It's a story. We all share a story. And if we don't understand that, we will never be able to match what's on the other side. It's a story of saving the republic. It's a story of building a union. It's a story of a more perfect union. What I realize now is those who are supposedly not the real Americans are the ones fighting to save this nation. What I realized is that those who told me that they were the ones who cared about God and country are the ones willing to turn their back on this republic in order to gain power at all costs. What I know now is that those who have been told for centuries that they are not part of this place, that they don't belong here, not true members of the American body politic, are those who are going to play the central role in saving this country from an authoritarian ruin and leading us towards a more perfect union. All of you in this room, a proud and courageous coalition of believers, non-believers, monotheists, polytheists, atheists, agnostics. We are the ones who won't give up on this experiment of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is our story. Despite all the stories that organize our different lives, this is our shared story of being Americans who are united. Just over 55 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his last speech in Memphis, the mountaintop speech. And he proclaims that he has seen the promised land. He says, I'm not sure if I'll make it, but I have seen it. When I discuss that speech with my students, we often tease apart the fact that the United States is a place of promises, as Rachel talked about. A place built on grand promises. The promised land is, as Dr. King says, the land where we were, where we are, promised the right to assembly, the right to free speech, the right to equality under the law without exception. Our story, I'm going to be honest, may not be one of reaching the promised land. It may be one of keeping our promises to each other. It may be holding everyone from our mayors to our state reps to our president to those promises. It may be one of promising not to give up in the face of the threats of inhumanity, inequality, oppression, and yes, authoritarianism. Just a few months before that mountaintop speech, Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And I'll tell you, I don't know if it does. And that's not because I doubt Dr. King's wisdom. I think it could. I think the arc of the universe could bend towards justice, but I don't think it's fated to. I don't think it's our destiny. I think the universe can and sometimes does bend towards justice. And I think that in this room, there is a coalition of people who draw on generations, who draw on long and deep and wide traditions of Black resistance, queer persistence, women's liberation movements, fighting against anti-Semitism, fighting against Asian hate, who can link arms and walk in that direction. I think we can walk as far as we deem possible. Regardless of what happens, we know that we will keep our promises to each other, and we will keep the promises to those who come after us. We will create a path for them to walk, a path that has already been created by those who went before us. I'll be honest, for me, it's not about the destiny of the universe. It's about a story that says we are here, we're going to link arms and go in that direction, and we're not going to be deterred. We're not going to give up, and we're not going to stop keeping those promises to each other. That, to me, is the chain of memory that we participate in. That's the chain of anticipation that we will leave behind. All the student leaders in this room, that is what we will hand off. That's what we give our kids. That's what we hope they will give theirs. That is the story we live out. That's the one we inherited from so many others. That's the one that we are now responsible for. That's how we win. Thank you.
So one of the things that we're doing a little differently here at SRF is our keynotes are two parts. The first is our featured speaker, and thank you again. Another round of applause for Brad. But each keynote is followed up by a panel of colleagues of his to deepen the conversation and explore the topics that he just discussed. And each keynote is discussing in further depth. Before I introduce those folks, I do want to remind folks, we love questions. Thank you for those who have submitted. Please go ahead and write these up. Put your hands up in the air when you have one. Doesn't matter at whatever time, and our staff will come around and pick those up. For those of you online, go ahead and use the Q&A function in Zoom to please submit your questions. We love them. And thank you all for participating in that. It is now my pleasure to welcome on stage to join Brad, Andrew Seidel from Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And Reverend Naomi Washington-Leapheart from the Political Research Associates, fellow at Harvard Divinity School, adjunct in theology at Villanova, member of AU's Faith Advisory Council, and my friend.
Thank you, Brian, and hello, everybody. So I'm excited about this. We're going to dive into the conversation. We're going to start off. We're talking about white Christian nationalism. And so we're going to start with the white. We're going to start with that first descriptor. Why do we need that descriptor when we are talking about white Christian nationalism?
I've talked a lot. Okay. All right. So if we just start with the sociological data, if we look at what sociologists tell us, what they'll tell us is that there are people of color who are what we might consider Christian nationalists. And that may be surprising, it may be jarring. However, the story that people of color who are Christian nationalists tell is one of usually hope. Now, that may not give you much comfort. You may not find this a positive thing, but the story is one that says, we're moving toward a more perfect union. The country has never lived up to its promises. White Christian nationalists on the whole, and this is what the data says, have the nostalgia narrative that I just talked about. It's a narrative that says this country has been ruined by fill in the blank people. It's been ruined by fill in the blank movements of the 1960s. It's been ruined by such and such and such, whether that was in the 60s, whether that was in the 1860s, it has been downhill from the time when the country was great. So white Christian nationalism is distinct. When you put the white in front of the Christian nationalism, it really starts to inform you about a worldview and a story of this country, a Christian story of this country that is distinct from others, even from other Christian nationalists in the country. And so what I argue in my book is that white Christian nationalism has always been about whiteness, always. That the Christian aspects of, and I know we'll get into this, Christian nationalism are there. However, that what they allow is for an expansive and kind of winding story that is protecting and upholding white supremacy. And so for me, there's really no discussing them apart. And yes, Christian nationalism may be the car, it may say Christian nationalism on the side, but whiteness is the engine, white supremacy is the fuel, and it always has been.
I would just add to that even when recovering evangelicals or recovering white Christian nationalists find themselves in more progressive Christian spaces, the desire to retain the element of white privilege that was so enjoyed, as Brad has been discussing, in evangelical white Christian nationalist spaces does not wane. That is to say that progressive Christianity or progressive Christian theology does not dilute one's white supremacy. I know it because I hang out in progressive Christian spaces with former recovering ex-evangelical folk who still have not recovered from, have not done the work around recovering from white supremacy. So this is how we know that these two things are tethered together. And without attention to both, we still have white supremacy reigning free in progressive Christian spaces. And so I just want to give that as an example of how these two things have become conflated in many ways.
I think you can see it a lot also in the desire to get back to the 1950s, as you were saying. I mean, the assaults that we are seeing on civil rights laws, working to undermine basic civil rights for everybody. They're coming after LGBTQ people first, but the next step in that is very clearly racial discrimination. And if you go back and listen to some of the oral arguments in these cases, the lawyers cannot distinguish between the two. It's a question that they really struggle with time and time again, in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case especially. And we know that the end goal of white Christian nationalism is privileging this particular group under the law, right? Conservative, white, heterosexual, cisgender Christian men, right? That it is them and nobody else who get the privilege. So the law will protect but not bind them, and everybody else is not protected but bound by the law. That's what they're going for here. So I mean, we've talked about. Well, Bradley, you already mentioned this. Let's talk about the Christian then in white Christian nationalism. We often hear that Christian nationalism is not Christian, that Christian nationalists are not true Christians. Is this helpful?
I agree. No. Because, one of the things I've been saying in our pre-conversations and to anybody who will listen to me is that, the Bible is not the panacea that we might think it is. The Bible is a problem. I say this as somebody who still claims the Bible as my book. The Bible is and has been a blueprint, a manual for empire, for imperialism. And we who want to dismantle this grounded in faith, Christian faith, that's what I'm doing, have to admit that the Bible is a contested text. That it's not in the Bible that we are conquerors in God's name. Not far to go from reading that text to showing up on January 6th at the Capitol. They said prayer in the Senate chambers in Jesus' name. And so, I think we have to start talking about the vulnerabilities of Christianity, the vulnerabilities of this ideology, this triumphalist ideology, this claim that we will win, and how that is so quickly mixed in to the recipe for imperialist ideas and discriminatory thought, and ultimately violence. So this is, I recognize this more as Christianity than some of what I'm preaching and teaching every day. That's when people hear me, they're like, that's not what I read in the Bible. So how is it that we can be reading the same text and conclude so differently? Well, because the text itself is contested. The text itself doesn't agree with itself. And we need to admit that, stand boldly in that, and not allow people to convince, and when I say we, I'm talking about Christian folk who would fight white Christian nationalism. I don't mean to generalize and sweep all y'all in, but we who are Christian have to admit that about the text and not allow folk to let that undermine our right to be in this conversation, simply because we admit the way the text has done harm. So white Christian nationalism is absolutely Christian, in my view.
I'll just add that I just agree wholeheartedly. And for me, as a scholar of religion, our mantra, at least in my circles, is religions are what religious people do. Christianity is what Christians do. And so if Christian people are doing everything that we've talked about here with white Christian nationalism, January 6th, so on and so on and so on, we have to take that seriously, right? Because I think the easier move is to say, well, that's obviously not Christian, and to sort of try to laugh off, shrug off them as not serious, right, actors. And I think what Reverend Naomi is saying is actually so much more important and fruitful, which is to say, if you are a Christian in the room, and you're not a white Christian nationalist, right? Your family's out there doing some stuff, and you might have the first line of responsibility, right, for talking to them about their claim of identity as a Christian. So I think that's something just to take to heart, because the move that says, well, they're obviously not real Christians and know nothing about Jesus, is one that allows you to do two things, right? What does that do for you, right? It allows you to claim the moral high ground and say, well, clearly I know right and they don't. But it also says they're not serious, right? I'm not taking that seriously. You're not a real Christian, therefore I'm not going to engage you on that level. And I just think that's a mistake. I think that leads to places, and we'll get further into the conversation about this, where there's a way of kind of shrugging or putting on to the fringe people who are very seriously affecting our republic by claiming that mantle of Christianity.
It's interesting you both mentioned January 6th there. And for me, that is one of the striking things about the Christian aspect of Christian nationalism. And it was so clear on that day in the signs that were carried, the Bibles that were held up, the flags that were flown. And to me, the religious element really came through there. I mean, the prayer in the Senate that they said, they carried the Christian flag onto the floor of the Senate. And then they said a prayer to Jesus. And I've often spoken of Christian nationalism as a permission structure. And I think it created the permission structure that allowed the January 6th insurrectionists to do what they did that day, right? If you are going to attack the beating heart of American democracy, you have to believe deep down that you are doing it for some higher reason, right? You have to give yourself permission to do that. And the religious element, I think, is inseparable from that permission structure. So if we were to separate that out, I think it would be a significantly less powerful potion for these Christian nationalists. Anybody want to add anything to that, or are we going to go on? Okay, yeah, go for it. No? Okay. Go.
I agree. It's a permission structure, but it's a story that they're living a story,
yeah.
Right? So by going to the Capitol that day, what they're saying is we're living the story as those who are the real patriots and the real Christians. We're not trespassers, right? We're God's warriors. We're not interlopers, right? We're the citizens who belong here, right? I mean, for me, it's really significant. If you watch the rioters at every stage, at every door, at every time they passed a new threshold going into that inner sanctum to the chamber, they say a prayer, right? Somebody leads. Why? Because what they're doing is they're stopping to reiterate the story that they're living out. And the permission structure is one that says, I have permission to do this because I'm a character, right? In a country that was built for and by my God, and I am his weapon on earth. And therefore what I'm doing is not something wrong. What I'm doing is exactly at the center of the universe and where I should be. And I think that's, to me, that when you say that, Andrew, permission structure, that's what I think of as that story that they're living out.
Also, if you've ever watched the photo and video, like, so many of them are fighting that battle one-handed that day because they are characters in their own story. They have their phones up, they're filming. This is how we caught so many. I swear if they had put down their phones, that day would have gone very, very differently. But it is because they're characters. So AU just launched its One Nation, All Beliefs campaign, and white Christian nationalism is about exactly the opposite. One nation, one belief. So let's really drill down on the last part of white Christian nationalism, that anti-democratic aspect of what they're doing. I mean, Bradley, you touched on it quite a bit, but I really think this is absolutely crucial for everybody in this room to understand that white Christian nationalism is inherently anti-democratic. So let's really make that clear for everybody.
You know, what just came to my mind was the idea that heaven's not a democracy. Right? I mean, if you believe in a God who rules with an iron fist and who is authoritarian and doesn't ask you, you don't get to vote on God's assessment of you, right? So it makes sense then that, I mean, in addition to what I thought, I was so compelled by what you were arguing, Dr. Bradley, about democracy being too inefficient and too inconvenient for the agenda of white Christian nationalism. It's also not godly. The idea, losing is not godly. And you can lose an election. You don't have to win the vote. You don't have to earn, right? your salvation. It is given to you by grace. It's not a, you don't, so it makes a lot of sense to me that from a theological perspective, authoritarian rule and anti-democracy are characteristic of white Christian nationalist ideas, because that's the theological worldview that they've constructed. God is not a Democrat. God does not ask for your vote. God simply rules, and you just better get in line, or pay the price. And so that sounds a lot like the kind of nation state that white Christian nationalists want to build.
I think that's one reason the big lie was so widely believed by white Christian nationalists, right? We could not have lost the election. It's God's will, Brad.
No, I just agree with everything that, all the sentiments. And I think that, again, I just want to ask what that does for you. So if God is an authoritarian who does not lose, and you see yourself as an extension of God on earth, then what you see your life as being about, the story you're going to live, is about dominion on this earth in the name of God. And dominion is another word for power. So if you think of a God, right, who has dominion over the whole earth as an authoritarian father king, and you are living as an extension of that father king, your goal is dominion. So when it comes to voting, when it comes to democracy, when it comes to listening to others, dialogue, respect, when it comes to coming to an understanding of different worldviews, those are all not part of the theological or civic picture. And it used to be that was said quietly, but it is no longer. And this is openly, I mean, Sean Foyt said it just this week. He talked about how Christians should be the ones writing the laws. Okay. Sean, do y'all know who Sean Foyt is? He has hair. Yeah, he has hair. Yeah. Look him up. The book I put up there, The Case for Christian Nationalism, Stephen Wolfe argues that this country should not be a democracy. He wants a hierarchical government with a Christian prince. He wants a situation where if you blaspheme, you say some of the wrong words or use God's name in vain, jail. Sabbath laws. Where are you on Sundays? Sleeping in, brunch, doing God knows what? Jail. You're an atheist? He says, I want to totally root that out of this nation. And again, you're like, well, weird manifesto, no one's reading. No. Top 100 on Amazon, bestseller, being read in seminaries by young pastors as we speak. And so I just agree with with everything that's being said. And it is not, this is not far-fetched. This is not a fantasy, and it's not the future. This is right now, today.
So one thing that's striking me as both of you are talking here is a conversation Rachel and I often end up having. A lot of our talks come back to this, and that is that the separation of church and state is the cure for Christian nationalism in America, right? They cannot get what they want if there is a separation of church and state, if that wall between the two is tall and strong and impregnable, as the Supreme Court once said it should be. And the two are fundamentally opposed to each other, truly, because they are seeking a Christian nation, and they don't get that if we build up that wall. Okay, everybody agrees. Anybody? Yes, concur. Okay. One thing I do want to talk about, and then how are we doing on time, folks? I haven't seen a timestamp. Good. Okay. One thing I want to talk about is Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, for a long time was kind of treated as this sort of impotent sideshow, right? Like some people thought it was this debate about history, myself included. Some people thought it was, this good faith debate about how the nation was founded. There were people who recognized that it was a threat, and there were people who started realizing it was a threat earlier on, including, I think, both of you. And I'm wondering, like, for the people who saw this coming, why do you think others missed it? And I'm thinking with an eye towards the future, because we have seen waves of Christian nationalism throughout American history. We've rebuffed some of them, but this one seems particularly virulent. So if we were to push this back to the fringe whence it came, how can we keep our eye out in the future and heed the warning of those who tried to warn us? Very eloquent, Andrew.
I think about William Jones, who a long time ago was asking, is God a white racist? writing at the same time as James Cone, who was writing, God is on the side of the oppressed, right? There's always been a prophetic critique of the use of God, the weaponizing of the Bible against the folk who are at the bottom of the pile, right? But we don't ever listen to the people who are at the bottom of the pile, so it doesn't surprise me that folks who have been sounding the alarm were ignored. The reason I am in theology and in theology classrooms is because I really do believe that if we can root out and interrogate theological claims, theological foundations that ultimately embolden people to construct political frameworks that cause this kind of devastation, we can do, like, it's not innocent. Theology isn't innocent. It isn't, abstract for, church nerds like me. It's not, it matters. It matters how people construct the notion of God in their imagination. It matters. It matters when I do a children's sermon and ask kids to draw a picture of God. It matters that they have already understood God in their imaginations at 5 and 6 and 7 years old as a big, strong white man who walks around with his shirt off like Putin. I don't know. That matters. It is not a phase. People don't grow out of it. They don't get more sophisticated as they get older. No. So I think religious formation is so important as a strategy to undermine and ultimately completely disrupt these kinds of movements. It still matters what people are learning in Sunday school classrooms every week in this country. It still matters what folks are reading in seminaries and theological schools. It still matters. And so I think a strong commitment to a kind of religious formation. If we're gonna form people religiously in these institutions, we have to do so responsibly and attentively, taking seriously the critique that womanist scholars, that queer scholars, that Latinx scholars that have contributed to the discourse.
I'm going to add real quick, just one, you reminded me forcibly, one of the photos from January 6th, the insurrection, it's that famous portrait of white Jesus, the head, and they photoshopped on a MAGA hat, and then the QAnon, what you see, or where we all, whatever that nonsense is, onto Jesus's robes. And to me, that was just one of the quintessential images from that day. You just forcibly reminded me of it. Anyway, go.
Well, and you just linked what I was going to say, because we have the image of God as the strong white man. And then I think one of the other reasons this has gone unnoticed is the image of the real American, right? And so if we ask kids in a 7-year-old or 10-year-old civics class, draw an American, right? For so long in this country, that has been a white Christian. And so when the white Christian is in front of you, when the white Christian in so many parts of this country, and I know I don't have to tell most of you because you know this, whether it's at a PTA meeting, whether it's at a mayoral debate, whether it's at who's going to be the county supervisor, if you stand up and you're a white Christian man, you have already the sense of, well, you're at the heart of the nation, right? You are the real American. You don't have to prove that, you are that. And everyone else has to sort of demonstrate it, right? Everyone else has to show that, okay? I think of I was just at a family reunion with my folks on Maui, and a lot of my dad's generation really revere the 442nd, who were the Japanese Americans who fought in World War II. And I totally understand why they do, don't get me wrong, okay? And I'm not here to criticize that. But sometimes I hesitate when I hear that, because what they're saying is, hey, those men who fought in World War II so bravely, they proved that we were real Americans. And I'm tired of proving that. We don't need to prove that. And so when white Christians equate to a real American, they get a pass when they stand up in front of the camera, when they say things that are violent and authoritarian and hurtful, as long as they have a suit on and they looked respectable, okay, the lens that this country uses is one that says, well, yeah, you belong there. That's where we expect you there. And unless this gets really out of hand, we're not going to dislodge you. That's a problem. And I know everyone in this room wants to change that. I know that that's what so many of the grassroots movements you're part of and the organizing, the lobbying that'll happen on Monday are aimed to do. But we can't, I say this all the time, and I know some of you heard it before, but we can't look at the white Christian nationalists as Ned Flanders. Ned Flanders is so irritating. And when he's at the barbecue, he's like, hey, should you really have another beer? You probably shouldn't, right? Okay. And he doesn't want you to use cuss words. And he doesn't seem unsafe, Ned Flanders, does he? But you know who we're dealing with is not Ned Flanders. It's Mr. Burns.
I think that bias has so infected our politics. And I'm going to ask one final question, and then we're going to get to y'all's questions. I guess this is actually a two-parter. First is, do you have hope that we will defeat this threat? And if you do, what gives you that hope? Bradley, you want to go?
All right, I'll go first. Next question. In the past couple of years in this country, we've seen the first trans representatives in state houses. We have openly gay governors in several states, right? Oregon and East Coast, West Coast. We have Asian American women being elected mayor of Boston. We have African American women being elected mayor in small towns and mid-sized towns and cities in North Carolina, where Black folks have been historically, barred from the vote. We have this room of people who understand what we're up against. And so, for me, when I hear that question, Andrew, what I think is, I don't have hope. I have to have hope. Because this is our story, and this is the path we're walking, and we can walk it together and go as far as we can get. And what I learned I'm just gonna be really honest with y'all. What I learned as a Christian nationalist is that there was no losing, because we were always destined to win. I mean, you said it, we were always gonna win, right? And I just want to say that there's no losing here. You run for office and lose, you ran. You organize, you lobby your representative, you write postcard after postcard, you show up at the State House and argue for trans rights. There's no losing there, because it's not that we have hope, it's that we have to have hope that we're going to move in that direction together. And so to me, I can tell you right now, when Christian nationalists, like 2022 midterms didn't go great for them, Doug Mastriano, Carrie Lake are at home, right? Thinking they're going to be senators someday, but they're not governors, okay? And none of the Christian nationalists who were working for them went home and are like, well, that didn't work out. Let's get a new hobby, maybe brunch, pickleball. A lot of people playing pickleball now. That sounds good. You know what they're doing? Plan B, C, D, and E. Because they didn't take that as we lost. They take that as let's go again. And so I just want to say that in this room, I don't know. There's days I don't have hope, but on those days I have to have hope. Otherwise, what else am I going to do? What other story are we going to live together?
Hope. I just said at an iftar Thursday night that I have a hard time believing in resurrection. I'm a Christian minister. That's supposed to be the close of every sermon, right? That the tomb is insecure. I have a hard time believing in resurrection because I'm surrounded by death. Full cemeteries. Decay of dreams and potential. So hope is hard for me. But I think that these days I'm less interested in hope and more interested in courage. Because I agree that we probably won't get there with you, as King knew. So I've had to shift from you know, and I grew up in a very kind of Christian nationalist adjacent community. And so I have to unlearn, deprogram myself to not see things in the binary of win and lose. But I take courage. That's what I do. I don't hope, I don't dream, I don't wish. I just take courage. What am I willing to be courageous for and about? What am I willing to risk losing for? I want to focus there on what helps me, what makes me courageous. Because when I'm courageous, I do things like, you know, showing up at the thing that I wasn't invited to and taking up space to preach about a God who looks like me. So I guess I'm just not, hope is kind of a future oriented connotation, and I can't think, I don't have the bandwidth or the spoons, as the young people say, to think about tomorrow. Like I feel like I don't have the luxury to dream about tomorrow, given the fire burning today. What I can do is figure out how to be courageous in the fiery moment. And that's a daily decision, and the daily act of courage is what moves us closer, I think, to the world that we want to be and see. So, yeah, I have a hard time. Don't ask me to preach on Easter.
I have hope because I do think at the most basic level, we are winning. That as we realize the aspirational values that are implicit in we the people and equal justice under law and those other founding maxims that fell so short, as we recognize that humans are human beings and worthy of rights, the power and privilege and deference that conservative white Christian America believes it's due is waning. It's dying. It's dying a slow demographic death, and they are what is happening is they are raging against the dying of their privilege.
Yeah, that's it.
And when a dominant group or caste in society feels threatened, it reacts or overreacts in ways to retain that power and privilege and status. And that is why we are seeing them turn to these so-called strongmen and turn to this anti-democratic theology, to this white Christian nationalism, right? They are losing, and so they are getting desperate. And because their entire fight is about privileging this small chosen few, every time they win, every notch that they put on their victory belt at the Supreme Court alienates more people and wakes more people up to the threat that they face simply for existing in this country. So they are fighting for selfish reasons, and we are fighting to be selfless. We are fighting for all of the people, and I genuinely believe we're going to win because of it. So how are we doing questions, Brian? Okay. I can't see over the light.
My mic's, there it is. Okay.
Okay. Hi,
Hi.
Tina.
I'll stand up. Otherwise, I'm going to be the voice in the corner.
Tina's one of our amazing policy team at Americans United.
I took the liberty. We had a zillion questions. Well, maybe not quite a zillion, but close. I combined some, so hopefully we get to as many as we can.
I'm going to ask you, put the mic right up.
Okay.
There you go.
Larry from Concord, New Hampshire, and Lee watching online. If framed as an us-them war, positions will only harden. How can we address Christian nationalists in a way to foster a productive dialogue? How should we engage?
Interesting.
I'm torn around the notion of dialoguing with people who want me dead. I hear the sentiment behind the question, which is how do we not harden in our silos? Is there a coming together necessary? Is there a, extending across the aisle necessary? I mean, I think so, but maybe not for all of us. I'm not going. Really. And that has to be okay. I think part of what sometimes sabotages progressive movements, particularly progressive religious movements, is the kind of sweeping way we try to conform to some notion of uniformity and kumbaya-ness that doesn't account for the ways that we have all experienced white Christian nationalism differently. We've all experienced the impact. Its tentacles have reached us in different kinds of ways. It causes different pain, right? Depending. And so, yeah, I think that some of that is going to be necessary. And I honestly don't give much thought to how to do that, because I think that that's somebody else's work to do, let me just say. So I think that is necessary work. We should not, as a movement, try to make that everybody's work. So
I think I think civically we're at a place, and if you read Andrew's book, you'll be convinced, and so many other great books. It's engagement civically is not going to help us. And what I mean by that is, my book is called Preparing for War, because this movement has been trying to prepare and wage a war for 60 years and much longer than that. So on a civic level, to me, the answer is not trying to engage, because there is no good faith engagement from the other side. Okay. And if you are engaged in a personal relationship by an abusive partner or friend, the advice that you're given is often not, well, how can you go make it better with them? Right. So my argument is, on a civic level, we have to realize the state we're in. And that is a state where white Christian nationalists and so many of their allies view this as a make or break moment for them to keep and maintain power, right? Or lose it for good. And that's how they think of the civic level. Now, if you are someone who can do this work, right? If you have a body and identity where you have people in your life, okay, that are Christian nationalists, your cousin, your colleague, your friend, your nephew, your mother, whoever, and you're going to stay in a relationship with them, okay, that's something that is happening. My advice is, when you do that work, and not everyone can do that work, not everyone should be expected to do that work, and it is not the responsibility. But but there are people in here whose work that is. Ask that nephew, ask that old friend from high school, ask that parent, what are you so angry about? Why are you resentful? Tell me about it. What are you grieving? What did you lose? What did you lose 10 years ago? What did you lose when Obama became president? Why are you so anxious? And let them tell you, okay? And they're going to say some really dumb shit. And your response can be, I can't believe you believe that. I'm now dumber for hearing it. Or your response can be, okay, so if I'm right, you're angry about this. If I'm right, you're angry about that. If I'm right, you're worried, hurt, resentful, grieving that. Okay. Can I tell you about me? Right? And there's a chance that you might get into a space where, instead of being what they've been told you are, because they've been told what you are is a godless communist who hates America. They've been told that you have sulfur DNA and demon DNA, and you smell like sulfur, excuse me, okay? They've been told that you're part of the serpent people. They've been told that you're part of the elites of, the cabal who wants to destroy everything through New World Order, right? There's a chance that if you talk on the level of affect and emotion, that might be stripped away for a moment, and you might just be their cousin or colleague or friend who's also worried about their kids, who's also anxious about the future, who's also really grieving, right? The changes that have happened here and there and all over the place. And there might be two people talking on a human level rather than on an ideological level. And then that relationship may have space for that going forward. But I can just tell you, and I know many of you in the room have done this, you've done the 378 comment long threads on Facebook, haven't you? Right? You posted the statistics, right? You went to Pew and you pulled it up from New York Times. Yeah, you did. I know you did. Big old vein in your head popping out. Pour another whiskey. Oh, I'm going to get him this time, right? And guess what? You got angry, you didn't sleep that night, and they just went to bed and didn't care, and they already forgot about it. And nobody was convinced, nobody was changed. So you can do belief, and this is again, religion professor, go ahead and do belief, or you can do affect and emotion and bodies. And if you have a body that it is safe to do this with, then that is the work I think you can do, and that's how I would go about it.
I agree with all of that. And please give them a round. There's power in your personal story. There's a lot of power in your personal story in the way that Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism has impacted you. I'll also just add, when you're going into the conversations that Brad is talking about, one of the things that I think is helpful is to set your expectations appropriately. You are not going to convince somebody and change their mind right there. Your goal should be to have an open dialogue that they can then come back to you. They have to change their mind. You cannot change somebody else's mind. The best you can do is plant those seeds so that they can go think on their own and change it. And if you leave that door open and they can come back and say, hey, I have a question on it, you're going to be far more effective. Let's take the next question then.
I'm back, the voice from the corner. I'm going to combine some questions on the fly. We have Anne and David both joining us virtually, Lauren from Denver and Eli from Charleston. So what is kind of like leading off of what you were just talking about? What is the best way to take action for this cause to rebuild the wall despite the forces aiming to tear it down? How do we ensure religious and secular people work together? And how do we, our goal is to keep them from co-opting the state. That's never ending. How do we kind of reframe the struggle and not feel exhausted?
Yeah, I mean, build a strong wall of separation between church and state by joining Americans United is one great thing to do. Sign the pledge. Look, one nation, all beliefs, sign the pledge. I mean, that is what this conference is about this weekend. It is about answering that question. I mean, you are going to get so many tools and ideas and relationships coming out of this. I hope every single one of you leaves just energized and ready to dive fully into this fight. That is the goal.
I'm thinking about the question around how we get secular folks and religious folks to collaborate and work together on this. I think it's worth sitting at a table together, wrestling with, I mean, yesterday, the AU board met and the Faith Advisory Council met, and it was thrilling for me. Now, granted, I'm a dork. We understand that, but it was thrilling for me to be in a room wrestling with the theological implications, the spiritual implications. Should we talk about the Bible? Should we not talk about the Bible? And talk about the legal case and the policy case. I mean, completely spiritual things, right? And there are enough intentionally convened conversations like that. And I think that what can perhaps undermine the collaboration between secular and religious groups, I say this as a religious person, as a religious leader, is the attempt to, I find, make the room all religious or all secular in terms of the conversations that we're trying to have. Either it's we need to get these Christians, and then the Christians in the room are like, hi, and we do need to get these Christians, and the conversation can't be all secular or all religious. If we're going to bring these two groups together, we have to make space to think together about religious stuff and about non-religious stuff, together, but we're doing the best of our thinking in these areas apart from each other. And I think that hasn't been helpful. So I'm really honored to be part of AU's attempt to actually have us around the same table talking about these things. I need to know the policy and law stuff, just like perhaps I can contribute some biblical stuff, analysis as well. So I think that that's helpful.
I just to jump off from there, I think that something I think about often is that freedom from religion is freedom of blank. So there's some Baptists in the room. I know you're all out there, right? And there's a long Baptist heritage that says freedom from religion is the basis of freedom of religion, right? But if we're going to have the kind of table that we're talking about, freedom of religion, freedom from religion is freedom of speech, right? Is freedom for bodily autonomy, freedom of assembly, right? So the church-state separation, and I think this is the whole point of being here this weekend, is the basis, right? So of the freedoms that we hold sacred, regardless of whether we're religious or not. So I think that's one way to think about it. I also think in fighting fatigue, and I know that folks in this room may, it's preaching to the choir, but when you go home energized from this weekend, my encouragement to folks who ask me these questions is, especially during the pandemic, it was hard to be involved in things. We couldn't get out there. And a lot of us just stayed home in sweats and doom scrolled for like 2 years. Did you all do this? Some of you? Yeah. You don't have to raise your hand, but I know. Okay. You just doom scrolled. And doom scrolling is the way to get fatigued real quick because you realize everything that's wrong and you do nothing to fight it. I say to folks who are just trying to get involved, pick one thing. You can't do 95 things. Do you have one cause? Do you have one issue that you have never been involved with? Okay, how are you going to join up with that? And guess what? And Andrew said it already, and Rachel said it. Doing things with others who are fighting for that cause energizes you. It feels good to be together, to feel our power, to know we have a dynamism, and to do it right as a group. Okay, there's a collective effervescence to that. So fatigue is real, burnout is real. But when we are together with others and we've chosen at least just one thing, right, to dedicate our time and effort and money to, and we trust that we have colleagues and allies and friends who are working on the other things and we can support them when it's time, then that's a way to get that person who's wondering back in your hometown, how do I get involved? That's just one thing. I know you were on Twitter last night and I know you want to tell me about everything that's wrong with water and climate, right? With incarceration. I mean, give me all the things. Go ahead. And I know I can see your bloodshot eyes and you're already tired. Okay. We need to stop with that. What's the one thing you're going to do after work twice a week for the next 6 months? What's the one cause you're going to give a weekend to, right? Once a month. Who are the people you're going to donate to and help? That's my encouragement.
Okay. So we are just about at the end. I'm just going to say, conservative, white, Christian, heterosexual, cisgender men, that is who white Christian nationalism is out to privilege. That, again, that is the goal. They think this is their country, but it's not. This country belongs to we the people, all of the people, and we're going to start taking it back right here at SRF today. Thank you all.
One more round. Oh, wait, where did you get going? One more round of applause for